I've posted a 4.5 page handout on Brightspace on Immanuel Kant, and I don't want to read it to you. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It goes into a little bit more detail than what you heard on the audio lecture. Just want to point out a few things to you, though. First, on the first page, two of Kant's most important works. And these are really hard to read. So if you have a lot of spare time in the summer and don't mind a hard slog and lots of questions, you can read these. But he wrote Critique of Pure Reason, which deals with metaphysics. And then 7 years later, in 1788, Critique of Practical Reason. Think practice, morality. So one book on metaphysics, one on morality. These are his most significant philosophical works. And next heading, Kant had this double problem, and this famous quote from him illustrates the problem. He said, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry heavens above and the moral law within." The starry heavens above, that's the external world, and the moral law within, that's the internal world. And Kant needed to save both of them. Both are really important for the Enlightenment, the modern person. The modern world values science, and the modern world values ethics, morality. And David Hume threatened both of them. He threatened science because he said perceived causality is questionable. How do you know for sure there is such a thing as causality? All you know is that you perceive it. You don't actually know it's there. If you can't believe in causality, well, there goes modern science. Hume also was very critical of God. And if there's no God, then how can you have morality? So Kant had this double problem. He wanted to save the world, science, nature, but also inwardly morality. And he's an ethics prof, so he really cares about morality. So he wants to rescue the external world, but it's hard to do that in a way that doesn't threaten morality. When I was a child, we go to a pet store, and the pet stores would have this aquarium, and they'd have often a snake in the aquarium. And they would sometimes put live mice in with the snake, and that was the snake's food. And I always felt really bad for the mice because they were going to be eaten. But in this analogy, think of modern science, the natural world, as a snake who's really sick. And so you want to save the snake and revive it. But if you revive the snake and he survives, then the mouse is in trouble. So how can you have a healthy snake and keep the mouse? How can you have the external world and morality? That's my illustration. I had a really rough childhood. Kant's double solution, number one, he rescued science from Hume's skepticism by positing the category of causality and 11 other categories in the human mind. And that's explained on page 2 and 3, and I have a diagram there. Kant's main innovation is, unlike Locke, who said, here's the external world and we conform to it, Kant said, actually, our mental categories contribute to the world. They're constitutive. They constitute reality. We don't just perceive reality. Our minds constitute reality. The world conforms to us. We're not just passively receiving perceptions from the outside world. Our categories actually contribute to it. Sort of like, now, of course, we are limited then to our categories. It'd be sort of like, again, from my childhood, we had a black and white TV for a really long time. We couldn't afford color. But of course, we knew that whatever we were watching, the football game, the players had uniforms on that were colorful. The Browns had orange helmets. We couldn't see it. We were limited to our black and white perception. So there was something more beyond us, but it was beyond us. We were limited by our categories, by our television set. So Kant, something like that, says our categories don't just perceive reality, they actually constitute reality. Reality is comprised by our categories. So it is very subjective, and yet Kant thought it still worked because he thought all the categories are universal. We all have the same categories, and so we're not just making stuff up. He could say that in the 18th century, but now in more of a postmodern world, the global village, we realize how we know so many other people that are different than us. It's harder to make the claim that we all have the same categories. So Kant did, without meaning to, planted the seeds for a later postmodernism. So first you say the outside world, the natural world, science, by putting causality in the human mind as one of the categories. But then that recovered the snake, right? And the snake's getting strong. How do you save the mouse? Well, Kant rescued moral freedom from modern science, which is now strengthened because of causality being in the human mind, by separating the phenomenal world that we perceive from the higher noumenal world in which God and the self and the essences of things exist. Kant was very hard to read and very complex, and scholarship divides over how to read Kant, whether Kant thought there were actually two separate worlds, the noumenal and the phenomenal. That's how the traditional view understood him. Or currently, the majority of philosophers think Kant said there's one world with two parts, a higher noumenal story and a lower phenomenal world. Either way, it basically kind of cashes out the same way, that our perceptions only perceive this lower phenomenal story. God's existence is up in a higher noumenal world, and we don't have access to him, so we can't critique him and say that he doesn't exist. He's just beyond us. But Kant was an ethicist, and so he said, if we don't believe that there is a God, well, good luck grounding morality. I described that argument on page 4 of your handout, Kant's moral argument for God's existence. And basically he says, we all agree that we should be moral, and if you want to tell someone that they should be moral, you're assuming there's a future judgment where God will call them to account and reward them if they're righteous and punish them if they're not. So if there is no God, well, good luck behaving like we all think we should behave and encouraging others to behave. You're just a sucker. So Kant says, because we know that everyone should be moral, and morality requires God, otherwise people won't be moral. Well, we don't know there's a God, but we have to believe in him. So that's, you can read the handout. I don't want to read it for you, but that's the basic synopsis of the summary on page 5 of some of the consequences of Kant. He agrees with Hume that empiricism cannot prove the existence of anything. Yet he says our rational constructs enable us to know the objects of the phenomenal world. Indeed, our constructs determine how we perceive reality, which is just as important as the external reality themselves. Our constructs determine reality, for reality is not just out there. The reality is just out there until labeled and understood by us. These constructs receive their legitimacy because they're universal. Everyone has the same ones. Yeah, you can read the rest of it. Just one other thing I can, not on the handout, but another book that Kant wrote, which is really important and dovetails from this. He's all about morality. And we need God to ground morality. And Kant says, he wrote a book. Here's one book he wrote that is readable. It's very accessible. It's called Religion Within the Bounds or Limits of Reason Alone. Religion within the bounds of reason alone, or religion within the limits of reason alone. It's sometimes translated both ways, or either way. The point is that religion for Kant is all about morality. It's religions within the bounds of reason alone and practical reason. So Kant, he denied the Trinity. He denied the incarnation. He said the whole point of religion is to make us more moral people, to behave better. Kant had this notion called the categorical imperative. Categorical means it applies to everyone. Imperative, a command. He says, here's how you should figure out what you should do. Ask yourself, would I want everyone universally to do this act? If so, then you should do it. If not, then don't. So kind of his version of the golden rule. Always do what you want everyone else to do. So Kant says, we all know that, and the whole point of religion is to help you perform the categorical imperatives, to do what you know that you ought. You don't need a trinity for that. You don't need incarnation for that. You surely don't need a substitutionary atonement for that. In fact, that kind of gets in the way. Kant said, if you tell somebody that Jesus died for your sins, and so if you want to be forgiven, just ask him to forgive you, well, that's going to really hurt morality, because a lot of people are going to sin now because they think grace is cheap. So he's very much against that. He wants religion to, the only point of religion is to help you become a better person. So Kant said, prayer, going to church, being baptized, taking the Lord's Supper, all these distinctively religious Christian acts, he says they're really pointless unless they help you become more moral. And he said, Jesus is actually a pretty poor moral example because he didn't suffer very much. He didn't sweat. It came really easy to him. But when you're trying to become a better person and you are feeling the sweat, the pain of doing the right thing, even when it hurts, that is you making atonement for yourself. So Kant really demonstrates what I would call the autonomy of the modern Enlightenment person, the triumph of the self. He starts with himself and what he thinks is right and wrong and what's best, and then he uses the Bible, the Christian faith, to encourage that. And any parts of the Christian faith that don't help that or even get in the way of that, he just dismisses them. So Kant would not believe in revelation. His God would be a deistic kind of God who exists, but he's off in the distance, and he needs him to later judge us all on how we did. But certainly there's no revelation, and because you can't know God, right? God's a noumenal idea. He can't invade your world. So Kant tried to rescue the Enlightenment project from Hume, thought he had saved science and the natural world by putting causality in our minds, and then thought he had saved morality from the rigidness of modern science, right? Modern science says that everything is predictable, right? There's all these natural laws that govern what we do. Well, if everything's a law, then how am I free? And if I'm not free, how can I be moral? So Kant rescued morality and freedom by saying, well, there is a God. We just don't know this God. But we need him to someday hold us account. All right, so that's Kant. Next up, Hegel.